everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Heart of the Family series virtually. Today we have Massey Arrington. He is the Executive Director of Wellstar Sleep Clinics. He's going to talk with us about the importance of sleep and how it's linked to heart health. Massey is a registered sleep technician and he has 27 years experience in the sleep field. He has an undergraduate degree from Tulane University in organizational behavior and an MBA from Vanderbilt University. Wellstar Sleep Program is the 5th largest in the nation and the largest in the state of Georgia with 12 sleep center locations. Now I'm going to turn it over to Massey to share the importance of sleep and how it's linked to heart health.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you for having me here today. It's my pleasure to talk to you about sleep and heart health. By the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of how our sleep affects our heart, as well as sort of an overview of some of the sleep disorders that we see most routinely. I'm the executive director over 12 sleep centers here in Atlanta with multiple locations. They're all accredited by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and most of them have been open since, I think our oldest opened in the late 80s, and Griffin has been open since 1999. The newest additions are at Cherokee Health Park and Vinings Health Park. So before I even dive into sleep and heart health, one of the things that I get asked is, why do we sleep? And you hear these fellows say, oh, I don't need sleep. There's plenty enough time for sleep when I'm dead. Well, sleep actually accounts for about a third of our lifetime. It's essential for our health and our well-being, and it restores the brain. One of the things that they've learned as they've begun to map the brain out is that we have all these neurons in our brain, and we can do certain activities like raising your hand. See, I just did that. Bunch of neurons fired. What happens is eventually you'll run out of neurons, and they won't fire, or they'll fire more slowly, or your response time becomes slower and more decayed. And if I were to never sleep, ever, for let's say 3 days, 5 days, I would eventually run out of brain power to perform certain functions in my body, not just lifting my hand, but important things like breathing and your heart rate. When you sleep, those neurons reset, and that's very important because it helps improve your health and your well-being and your ability to not just perform motor activities, but to think. Sleep facts, how much sleep do we need? That's the next most common question I hear. The magic number seems to be about 7 hours in a 24-hour period. 8 is okay. Too little sleep is very bad for your health, and too much sleep, believe it or not, especially if you're lying down for a prolonged period of time beyond 8 hours, creates too much intrathoracic pressure and can cause strain on your heart. 7 to 8 hours is the magic number. Now, younger kids and infants, they obviously need more sleep. The key point here is that sleep deprivation is extremely harmful to your health. When you're sleeping properly, enhanced tissue growth occurs, brain development occurs in younger people. REM is one of the stages of sleep that we tend to score. You can see this person here, and you can probably see the little squiggly lines. This is what I get to look at a lot of times when I'm reviewing sleep studies. But REM sleep and slow wave sleep help take what is in your short-term memory and put it into long-term memory. These things are beneficial for learning, for your emotional health. Now, non-REM sleep is really beneficial for your physical health. All mammals on the planet sleep, and many of us, like whales, for example, all have different functions that occur when we're sleeping. Now, if you don't get enough sleep, sleep deprivation leads to a lot of problems. And there's two types. There's acute, which is, you're having a rough day, somebody cuts you off in traffic, tax season, maybe something happened to your family, the death of a loved one, divorce, change in your job. Those create typical short-term or acute insomnia problems, but there are other people who suffer from total sleep loss and even chronic insomnia. And the chronic insomnia can be caused by things that are physical or something that's going on during your sleep that you may not even know about, hence the need for a sleep study. The most common thing we see in the United States is just this chronic insufficient sleep time. We have become accustomed to looking at our phones, watching TV, surfing the internet, watching the news. doing all sorts of other activities in the bedroom other than sleep. The bedroom is essentially for sleep or maybe intimate time with a partner, but it's not really the place for eating, surfing the web, watching movies, etc. But the other chronic problem we do tend to see is a fragmentation of sleep. There is something that's interrupting your sleep, and it's causing you to not get adequate sleep, and it's causing you to be sleepy all the time. Now, what does that do? Well, first off, it decreases your quality of life. Nobody likes to feel like they're dragging around all the time. It leads to memory problems, fatigue, depression, anxiety, and more importantly, one of the reasons I'm here talking today is it leads to increased chance of stroke, diabetes, hypertension, and overall heart health and heart disease. And I'll get in a little bit more about the connection between your kidneys and your heart in just a little bit. Another thing that's a danger for people who have chronic sleep loss is an increased likelihood of accidents, motor vehicle accidents, accidents on the job, and then there's things that we refer to as microsleeps. And that's where you may drift off literally for a split second. In Atlanta traffic, normally, maybe that won't cause an accident because we're going so slow. But if you can imagine, if you're doing 80 miles an hour down an interstate in a big 18-wheeler rig and you fall asleep for a fraction of a second, that's all the time it takes for something catastrophic to happen. Now, in society, Americans in general anyway, we sleep about an hour and a half less than our ancestors 100 years ago did. The irony is we still need the same amount of sleep. Travel, electric lights, shift work, surfing the web, some of the other things I just mentioned. There's also this misperception that sleep is negotiable, that it's wasted time, that sleeping less is macho or somehow desirable. But the fact is sleep deprivation has serious effects on your body. It leads to death. If you stay awake long enough, eventually you will die. But a chronic lack of sleep and heart disease are very closely linked. A lack of sleep and heart disease can stem from the body's weakened state, and there's an inability for you to function at your highest potential when you don't get enough sleep. And in these days with COVID-19, it's very important to understand that one night, just one night of poor sleep can drop your immune system by 70%. And right now, we all need our immune systems to be functioning at their highest. So are you getting enough sleep? If you're looking at this graph, studies by the National Sleep Foundation show that adults are getting fewer and fewer hours of sleep over time. These surveys take place about every decade or so. The oldest here is from 1998, and the most recent is from 2005. We were expecting to do one this year, but it got delayed. I'm looking forward to seeing what those results show. But as you can see, over time, more and more Americans are reporting that they're getting less than 6 hours of sleep. It's about the same state that they're getting 6 to 6.9, with 23% in 1998 and 24% in 2005, which is excellent. Patients stating that they're getting more than 8 hours of sleep, of course, did decrease to 26% in the most recent survey. So another thing that's tied with our sleep is how stressed we are. There's a significant correlation between your stress level and your levels of cortisol and how well you're sleeping. 65% of Americans claim that they get less sleep due to high amounts of stress. 32% state that they're losing sleep at least one night a week, and 16% of Americans experience stress-induced insomnia. That's a significant number. And as you can imagine right now, during these unique times of a pandemic, that's adding an extra level of stress. So how can you tell if you're sleep deprived? You probably know the old story. I've never tried it because it's pretty horrific. But, supposedly, you can take a frog and throw a frog in a pot of boiling water and the frog will jump out. Oh, it's too hot. But if you take a frog and you put him in a pot with cold water and slowly bring it to a boil, the frog will stay in there, unfortunately, supposedly. I don't try it. But my point being is many of us, as we age and as we go through time, we sort of don't notice the little effects of sleep deprivation. Or we write it off as I'm getting older, or maybe I need to lose some weight. Things that you can hone in on to identify if maybe you're having a problem you might want to mention to your physician. Do you have to have an alarm clock? One weekend, try not setting it. Will you oversleep significantly, or do you still wake up at right about the same time you always do? Do you fall asleep almost as soon as you hit the pillow? Normal people, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to fall asleep. Do you nap really easily? Do you find yourself needing to take several naps a day? Naps aren't necessarily bad, but it can be a sign that you might be sleep deprived. And another tool is the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, which is a series of questions which can determine how sleepy you are. Other things that'll give us sort of a signal as to whether or not you're performing not at your best is, are you driving drowsy? People who are sleep deprived have about a 2 to 4 times greater chance of getting into a motor vehicle accident. We see about 100,000 auto accidents, 71,000 injuries, 1,550 deaths, and about 20% of all drivers have stated that they've fallen asleep at least once behind the wheel. And again, one night of sleep deprivation, just to give you an idea, is the same as being legally intoxicated. So, nobody wants to drive drunk. You shouldn't be driving sleepy either. There's also been a link to certain natural disasters, things you've probably read about or heard about in the news. The Chernobyl incident, those scientists had, on average, got less than 4 hours of sleep per night for a consistent period of time. 3 Mile Island, the Challenger explosion, the Exxon Valdez spill. These were all contributed by errors in judgment from fatigue and excessive sleepiness. Another thing that I like to point out is sleep has a very significant impact on your appetite. People who tend not to get enough sleep tend to eat more, and what's worse is they tend to eat things that are not necessarily heart healthy or healthy in general. They tend to crave things like sweets or chips or starchy carbs, something that's going to give them a boost of quick energy so that they can keep going throughout the day. Having good sleep, along with a sensible diet and exercise, creates sort of the triangle of good health. But you can't really focus on any one or two of them when you're not doing all three. Sleep apnea. I'm going to have to talk about this. It's probably the number one sleep disorder that we see across all of our sleep centers. It affects about 10% of all adults over the age of 18. We've seen research that reports that there's a dramatic increase in folks having sudden cardiac death as a result of untreated sleep apnea. And once you're over 65, it affects about 25% of adults. Risk factors for sleep apnea: family history, obesity, thyroid disease, how old you are, and a history of smoking, even if you quit many years ago. Folks who tended to smoke at some point in their life have a softer palate, and the airway is much more likely to close off. Apnea puts a tremendous amount of stress not only on your kidneys and your brain, but specifically on your heart. So what is sleep-disordered breathing? Well, essentially, it's a cycle. Breathing stops or pauses, and this is not, you're not trying to breathe. And what's worse is, this is not you holding your breath. And apnea doesn't occur after you breathed in. Unfortunately, it occurs after you've exhaled. Everyone watching this can probably take a nice deep breath in and hold it for 30 seconds with no problems whatsoever. But I would task you to try to exhale all the way out. See how long you can go before your brain kicks in and makes you take a breath. Even at 10 or 12 seconds, your blood oxygen is going to start to drop and you're ready to take that breath. That's what happens at night. Your airway closes off. There's a pause. Sometimes it only closes off partially, so you get really loud snoring. But in the bad cases, it's a complete collapsed airway. And I'll show you some pictures in a second. And then you wake up, your brain tells you to wake up, and it sends a message to the kidneys, which releases a little burst of adrenaline. You wake up, you take that breath, that gasp, and then suddenly you fall back asleep. And unfortunately, the process repeats. And I would like to say that snoring, although it sometimes sounds funny, and it's you often make fun of that uncle or that cousin that you don't want to go on a camping trip with, it's never normal. The actual sound of snoring is a collapsed airway reopening. But what's scarier, and what we see in the sleep center, is about 25% of all sleep apnea patients, they don't snore at all. They're deathly silent. And then they gasp for air. So here's a picture of a normal airway from the side. And as you can see, nice open airway. The air's coming in. Yes, when you're asleep, most of us do try to breathe through our nose. Here in the South, sometimes our nose does get clogged up or we have allergies, and you'll find yourself opening your mouth and breathing through your mouth. That doesn't necessarily mean you have sleep apnea, it just means you have allergies, but it is important to differentiate. Now, with loud snoring, what we see or what we score as hypopneas, and that's where the airway is partially closed, but not completely, and the airway is just vibrating. And you get this, right? Now, what you could probably think is, well, no harm in that, at least they're breathing. Yes, but what we found is that your brain treats that the same because it's not a complete breath. You're not getting the complete oxygenation you normally would, and the snoring itself and the mechanism where your body arouses you, it interrupts your sleep. So even though you may not have as detrimental of effects as a really low blood oxygen, your sleep is still being disrupted. You're not getting the deep sleep that you probably need, and you're probably making a bed partner miserable. So here's an apnea. Now with a complete apnea, you've exhaled and your airway completely closes off. Nothing's coming in. Now, a lot of things happen right now. Your brain goes, we're being attacked. It doesn't differentiate that, hey, you're just asleep and maybe your airway's collapsed. It thinks you're being strangled or attacked. Adrenaline mode kicks in. This is going to send a signal to your kidneys. Your kidneys are going to send the adrenaline out. All of your arteries are going to constrict because it's going to try to save what blood oxygen you have, and your heart rate's going to increase dramatically. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second. This is so that you can keep those important organs like your brain and your liver and your kidneys oxygenated. And eventually, hopefully no longer than 20 or 30 seconds, you'll wake up and take a good breath, oxygen will return, and hopefully you'll go back to sleep. Now, that tends to repeat. So here are the squiggly lines I was talking about. This is a sleep study. You have brainwave activity and airflow. I just want you to focus on the lines at the bottom. This is where the patient's breathing and where I can see that the patient's trying to breathe. This is a normal patient. This was a 39-year-old African-American male who came to see us. And this is a 1-minute screenshot that you're seeing here. So as you can see in the first half of the screen, there's no airflow. I've got this highlighted in blue. And if you look at the very bottom where I have that section highlighted in red, that is the patient's blood oxygen. So here you've got the patient not breathing for about 25 seconds. And then you can see all the stuff at the top is where they wake up. So the heart rate dramatically increases. The blood oxygen drops all the way down into the low 70s. Patient wakes up, takes that gasping breath. You can see where they're awake. Now let's look at that same patient. Let's look at 2 minutes. So if you look here, in 2 minutes, the patient's actually only breathing 8 times. 8 breaths in about 2 minutes. The rest of the time, it's complete lack of airflow. Now, this patient was brought in, he didn't think that he had anything wrong. He was recommended and brought in by his spouse. As you can imagine, he's probably been doing this for years whenever he's asleep. And he's actually not breathing more than he's breathing. This constant cycle of the heart speeding up and slowing down and speeding up and slowing down and blood oxygen dropping and coming back up, it's doing tremendous damage to the heart, to the brain, and to the kidneys. This is going to take its toll. So it's scary stuff, but it's easily treatable. And just to give you another picture, right here, when he's not breathing, airway's completely closed off. Very, very dangerous. And I only showed you 2 minutes of what was a 7-hour study. This patient did it all night. And a lot of people do, and they don't realize that they have it. They don't realize that they're suffering for this. They start to gain the weight. They drink more coffee. They eat a little less healthy. Then the hypertension kicks in. A few years after that, perhaps diabetes. A few years after that, perhaps their first heart attack. Left untreated, sleep apnea will kill you. It's horrible. How prevalent is it? About 100 million people globally, 20 million American adults. It's very similar to that of asthma. Most of us know somebody who has asthma. 1 in 4 adults. I think the numbers are a little higher in the South because of other factors. We tend to be a little heavier, and we tend to have more allergies and other things that make breathing even harder. The downside and the importance, the fit where Wellstar comes in with our sleep centers is that 85 to 90% of the patients who have sleep apnea are left undiagnosed and untreated. And apnea doesn't just affect older, overweight men. It has to do with how your airway is built. So it doesn't discriminate. All ages, we have children, we do sleep test studies on kids as young as 2. All ages and both genders, all genders can be affected by sleep apnea. So what are the consequences? Well, as I've said, in the short term, increased likelihood of getting into a car accident, excessively sleepy during the day, significantly decreased quality of life, and some minor neurocognitive and performance deficits. That's a fun word, deficits. Maybe you can't remember where you put your keys last night. Little things. And then the long-term consequences, hypertension, heart disease, heart attack, arrhythmias, stroke, and impaired glucose tolerance, just to name a few. It's also important, unfortunately, to note that patients who have untreated sleep apnea tend to have higher job turnover or more frequent job loss, and they have a much higher rate of divorce. So what are the symptoms? Excessive daytime sleepiness. Snoring is your number one indicator. It's never normal. Somebody tells you, they see you pause while you're breathing at night, you wake up physically choking, gasping for breath, or you leap out of the bed and your heart's racing. These are all very strong signs. If someone in your family has been treated for sleep apnea, there is a genetic prevalence for sleep disordered breathing as well. Other signs, waking up with a headache, being extremely irritable, depression, memory loss, lack of concentration, getting up to go to the bathroom frequently at night. Typically, once or twice is actually not abnormal, but if you're waking up every hour, hour and a half to use the bathroom, that's a very strong sign. And that all comes from the intense pressure sleep apnea is putting on your kidneys. Also, unfortunately, a lot of men report sexual dysfunction with untreated sleep apnea. In the outside world, there's a loss of productivity. Companies suffer from billions of dollars of losses due to people who suffer from sleep disorders that aren't treated. Snoring spouse syndrome. You can imagine what it must be like for a bed partner if the other person is constantly snoring and waking them up throughout the night. That's our number one referral, by the way. Bed partners, spouses, significant others, sometimes family members. But they bring the patients in. And I used to bring this poster with me back in the 90s when I was doing talks because there was this misperception that snoring was funny or that it wasn't bad. And so I used to do, snoring can kill. Obstructive sleep apnea can be linked, as I said, to hypertension. We see about 30 to 50% of the patients with sleep apnea have hypertension. One of the things that's really an indicator is if your hypertension is drug resistant, or if you tend to be placed on more than one hypertensive medication, very strong indicator that you have untreated sleep apnea. We also see 40 to 50% of patients with congestive heart failure have sleep apnea. Many times it's either obstructive or in their case central, which is where you're not even trying to breathe. We see a high correlation with AFib. The adjusted odd ratio associated with AFib and OSA is about 2.1. So it's a 2.1 to ratio. That's pretty significant. And then, of course, diabetes. 87% of obese type 2 diabetics tend to have untreated obstructive sleep apnea. Now, the link between sleep apnea and heart failure. Congestive heart failure affects about 1.5 to 2% of the population. This is a direct cost to about $20 to $40 billion. We see a very high prevalence of sleep disorder breathing in patients with congestive heart failure, up to about 50%. And the mechanisms in obstructive sleep apnea and that constant speeding up and slowing down of the heart over time as a result of obstructive sleep apnea is helping exacerbate the onset of congestive heart failure. So how do we diagnose it? Well, as I said, many patients don't even realize they have it. We get a complete history from the patient and often from family members. We take a look at other comorbidities and other medical problems that they might have. We do an extensive evaluation of their medications. There's a lot of different medications that can affect the severity of your sleep apnea. Muscle relaxants and painkillers primarily tend to cause the airway to be collapse more frequently. We do a complete physiological and neurological exam. And then, of course, we would recommend testing at a Joint Commission or American Academy of Sleep Medicine accredited sleep testing center. So how do we treat it? Well, I'll talk about that. For mild sleep apnea, there's some oral appliances that you can use. This is primarily your patients that are at that early onset of sleep apnea. They're presenting with mild snoring. Maybe their daytime sleepiness isn't significantly severe. And it's a good option for mild to moderate sleep apnea patients. There are some side effects. You're wearing an appliance at night. It can cause some TMJ discomfort. Over time, there can be dental misalignment. and of course excessive salivation that we see with most nighttime mouthpieces. There's a picture of one. Essentially what it's doing is it's taking the lower part of your jaw and holding it forward a little bit and preventing the jaw from moving back. Everybody, when they go to sleep at night, their jaw relaxes, especially in REM sleep, and that brings the base of the tongue back a little bit, and it can block that airway just enough to cause the snoring. This prevents that from taking place. There's a picture of one. There's many on the market. Unfortunately, a lot of insurance companies don't cover it, but there are plenty of dentists in the Atlanta area that do have these, and it's a very successful treatment for mild sleep apnea. Surgery can be an option. We used to see this surgery performed. I like to call it a UP3 because it's hard to say that word, but it's a uvulopalatalopharyngeoplasty. And that's basically where they would go in with a laser or a scalpel and remove your tonsils and open up your airway a little bit. This was not very efficacious, and what we ended up seeing is that it was very painful surgery, and a lot of times the scar tissue that would be there, the patients would still end up with some form of residual apnea. So this surgery is not performed as often as it used to be. A little bit more radical is a surgical procedure known as the genioglossus advancement, and that's where they basically take a part of the front of your chin bone, which is connected to the base of your tongue, and they chisel it out and twist it, and it brings the entire back of your tongue forward. It's painful, but it is efficacious. It does open the airway up a little bit. There have been different reports of people maybe it changed their voice a little bit, but overall it was. We've seen some really good success with that surgery. A little bit more radical, and this would be only in the specific patients who have what we would call a retrognathic jaw, or the jaw is set really far back, or they have an underbite. They basically take the jaw and they break it on both sides, slide the jaw forward, and put in a metal plate. It does change a little bit of the structure of your face. It's extremely successful when it's indicated. But as you can imagine, it's expensive and the recovery time is pretty lengthy. There are limitations to surgery and appliances. No surgery or appliance is more than about 40% effective. Surgery on the upper airway, we only recommend it in adults as a last alternative. Other modalities just haven't been effective. However, in children, typically they will recommend a tonsillectomy very frequently if we see children who have sleep apnea. So what's the process? Basically, you think that you have a sleep problem. You mention it to your doctor or clinician, nurse practitioner. They say, yes, you might have sleep apnea, or you have symptoms of a sleep disorder. Then they'll make a referral to the sleep center for us to perform testing. Now, at this point, you can go see a sleep specialist first, but many times your physician or nurse practitioner can order a sleep study directly with our program. Then we'll do a sleep study, and it can be many different ways. They do offer home sleep apnea testing. It has its limitations, but it specifically only tests for sleep apnea when you're in your home. A little bit better of a choice is in-center testing, or what we call a split night, and that's essentially where you come in for a sleep study to one of our facilities, and if we see that you have sleep apnea, we'll go ahead and try to treat it before the end of the study. And then you'll meet with a physician. They'll discuss the results, treatment. If you've had a home study, you may end up needing to come back into the sleep center for a CPAP titration. I'll show you CPAP in just a minute. And then finally, we'll get the therapy dispensed through a DME company and follow up with you, typically at least 3 months after your testing, and then at least annually after that. So treatment, the number one treatment option is PAP, which is positive airway pressure. It comes in several different modalities. There's continuous, there's bilevel, there's automatic servo-ventilation. It all depends on what your sleep study reveals, what type of sleep apnea you are suffering from. The most common is CPAP, which is continuous positive airway pressure. And essentially, we're just providing air pressure into your airway as you breathe. And by having that constant pressure, the airway is never able to collapse. The CPAP treats your airway. It creates like a pneumatic splint, almost like when you're blowing up a balloon, and it won't allow that airway to close off. And what we do in the sleep center is we try to find what pressure it takes to keep your airway open. And once we do that, you're able to breathe and hopefully go from the left picture here to the right. Now, I will tell you, originally when CPAP first came out, there were like 2 masks. They were very uncomfortable. There were not a lot of choices, and the CPAP machines were the size of a small refrigerator and made a ton of noise. Nowadays, they're about the size of a small alarm clock. They're very quiet, and there are literally hundreds of masks on the market. There are masks for men, there are masks for women. There's masks that only cover your nostrils. There are masks that cover your nose and your mouth. There are masks that cover your entire face. Entirely up to you. The idea is to find something that you can sleep comfortably with. As a CPAP user myself, I haven't slept without it in 20 years, but I will tell you it took me a good 6 months to find a mask I could sleep with. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit because we are talking about sleep and heart health, and there are some other factors other than just sleep-disordered breathing. Poor sleep in general can cause its own issues. And the second most common disorder that we hear about or see has to do with the complaint of insomnia. Essentially, in people who truly suffer from insomnia, i.e. it's not being caused by a medication or by arousing from sleep apnea, the brain itself is not shutting down. This can be genetic, this can be from lifelong habits, medication you're taking, excessive stress, your lifestyle, and we definitely wanted to mention that in patients who suffer from chronic insomnia, we see a dramatic increase in the incidence of heart failure. So you don't want to let insomnia go untreated. You definitely want to speak to your physician about that as well. What causes insomnia? Well, stress, depression, anxiety, other sleep disorders. And I do like to mention that because a lot of times patients, there's something that they're doing during their sleep wakes them up, and then they have an inability to fall back asleep. We see that very frequently. We actually see it in young people who have the onset of sleep apnea even, and that's because their adrenaline response from having a single apnea is so great that they stay awake for an hour to an hour and a half before they're able to fall back asleep, and they fall back asleep and then they do it again. But movement disorders, kicking your legs, restless legs syndrome. Some people are extremely sensitive to caffeine and forget to realize that caffeine has a 12-hour life. So if you drink a cup of coffee at noon, that caffeine hasn't left your system until midnight. So you can imagine if you're sensitive to caffeine and you try to go to bed at 9, you're still wired from that cup of coffee you had at noon. Other people have developed sort of an irregular sleep-wake schedule where they have swing shift jobs. They have circadian rhythm disorders. We see this in a lot of teenagers who have, over time, stayed up too late playing video games, and then when they try to go back to a normal, like school time schedule, they can't go to sleep on time because they've gotten used to staying up, maybe being stimulated. Other things that cause insomnia: pain dramatically. If you have joint pain or arthritis, that can fragment your sleep. And then, as I think I mentioned, medications. There's a lot of different medications, and some medications affect people differently. For example, allergy medication. I have to take it in the morning. It wires me. My wife has to take it at night. It makes her sleepy. So some people, medications will affect you differently. Thyroid medications, another good example, and even certain heart medications. So speak to your doctor about that and maybe adjust the timing if you think a medication is causing you to have insomnia. Restless legs and periodic limb movement disorder. I specifically want to mention these. Periodic limb movement disorder is when you are asleep, but you're essentially moving your leg every 5 to 90 seconds. You're flexing your foot, and indications of this, you'll wake up often with the sheets pushed down in the bed, maybe having some leg cramps. Restless legs is a little different. It's an uncontrollable urge to move your legs right when you're trying to fall asleep. If you don't suffer from restless legs, it's very hard to describe. I've heard some unique phrases, the creepy crawlers, the tingling. We see a lot of women, they'll come in, they'll put a pillow between their knees or their ankles. This is diagnosed on a sleep study in a sleep center. The reason I mention it in today's talk is that what we're seeing is these patients tend to have double the risk of stroke and heart disease. And there does seem to be some sort of connection between periodic limb movement disorder, restless legs, and Parkinson's disease. It's very easily treatable, most of the time with dopamine agents. In some cases, it's an iron deficiency. And in many people, it's simply caffeine avoidance or maybe having their caffeine early enough in the day so it's not disrupting their sleep. So when should you see your doctor? Anytime sleep limits your activities during your daily life, you should talk to your physician about it. Sleep should be considered a vital sign. When you go in, they take your blood pressure, they take your temperature, they check your weight and your height. They should ask you about your sleep as well. It's very important. Insomnia and daytime sleepiness is never normal. I don't care how old you are. If you are unable to stay awake, you should definitely speak to a physician. Now, differentiating the cause of some of these problems is going to require a sleep specialist because, as you saw, many of the things I mentioned sound like maybe old age, dementia, early onset Alzheimer's, other things that you might associate with neurocognitive problems or memory loss or feeling run down. Don't automatically assume, definitely talk to your doctor, and the sleep specialist can determine the cause of what you're suffering from and the appropriate course of treatment. The problem is that most people don't seek help. They assume that poor sleep is inevitable as we get older, and that's absolutely not true. And as I've shown, the impact it has on your cardiovascular system, it's not worth it in the long run. It's so much easier to fix the sleep apnea when you're a teenager than to wait until after you've had your first heart attack. Some other ideas, though, that I wanted to leave you with for behavioral treatment options, like what can you do if you don't want to, like you can do this immediately while you're waiting to talk to your doctor. Try to have a regular sleep-wake schedule. Get up at the same time every day. Many of us like to sleep in. Believe it or not, clinically, there's no real benefit other than us just being lazy on Saturday mornings. If you really want to truly catch up on your sleep, scientists have discovered that it's much more effective to try to go to sleep earlier the next night rather than sleep in. Avoid stimulants and stimulating behavior. Most people don't realize, like if you're watching TV at night in your bedroom, don't forget to set the timer on your television. As an example of how this could be disrupting your sleep, the new televisions emit electromagnetic radiation. Now, it's not enough to really cause you harm. The problem is, even with your eyes closed, what your brain interprets that as is sunlight. So if you leave your TV on all night, your brain is actually limiting your melatonin release. It's different for different people, but we encourage you not to do things that are extremely stimulating. Playing a video game or having any electronic device right in front of your face is really not going to benefit your sleep. Most new devices now, if you're reading with a tablet, have a blue light mode or a nighttime mode that releases less radiation, and that's fine. If you want to read a few chapters, just be sure you turn that on. Limit your daytime naps to no more than 2, and naps should never really be longer than 30 minutes. If they are, you run the risk of affecting your nighttime sleep schedule. You've probably heard every doctor say this. I'll repeat it. You want to eliminate alcohol and caffeine, or at least reduce it. Excessive caffeine will disrupt the heck out of your sleep, even if you're one of those people that thinks it doesn't affect you. We've studied the brain waves, and we can see what we call microarousals that you may not be aware of. Just as an effect of caffeine, we also see a reduction in the amplitude of normal sleep brain activity if you have excessive caffeine when you're trying to go to sleep. And alcohol has its own issues. It improves your sleep efficiency for the first third of the night, but then tends to disrupt your sleep dramatically for the next 2/3 of the night. So that nightcap may help you get to sleep, but it's going to make your sleep apnea worse, and it's going to make your sleep much more disruptive. Get regular exercise, and it doesn't have to be something major like CrossFit, a walk, something that just gets you moving. Maybe joining a gym and doing mild exercises. Just try to not to do it right before bed. Don't exercise heavily within 2 hours of trying to go to sleep. And then try to avoid clock watching. A lot of people wake up every hour and look at their phone, or they look at their clock, or they, try to avoid that if at all possible. Sleep testing, it's not as bad as you think. We do put some wires on you, and we'll bring you up into, these shots are with some of the older devices, and I think the lady on the left actually has one of the home devices. But normally, when you come into one of our programs, I'll show you a couple of pictures. Our bedrooms are huge, spacious, and beautiful. We figure if you're going to have to come spend the night at Wellstar, it's going to be fun, at least as fun as we can make it. We have a group of, I want to say we have over 12 board-certified sleep specialists here. Our medical director is Dr. Hitendra Patel, and I've listed a few others that are also boarded in sleep. In addition to our board-certified sleep specialists, we also have nurse practitioners who are across the system that can help as well. And here's a shot of our sleep bedrooms at Ackworth Health Park. As you can see, they're lovely and spacious. So we are going to put the wires on your head. We're going to try to pull them back so they're out of your way. But spending one night with us and getting your sleep apnea treated can have significant improvement on your overall heart health. And in summary, I just say, if you are sleepy and you feel that your sleepiness is interfering with your everyday function, you might have a sleeping problem that should be addressed, and help is available. So there's our phone number for Wellstar Sleep Services, and I thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Massey. As you've learned here today, sleep is so important to our health. If you feel that you have undiagnosed sleep apnea or you would like to be evaluated farther, please contact your physician for a referral to one of the Wellstar Sleep Clinics. Or you can be screened through our Know Your Heart program. Know Your Heart is a preventative heart screening program to determine your risk of heart disease, stroke, and other serious conditions such as sleep apnea. Thank you for tuning in to our talk today, and be well.